Ngày mai em đi, biển nhớ tên em gọi về, gọi hồn liêu rũ lê thế, gọi bờ cát trắng đêm khuya. Ngày mai em đi, đôi núi nghiêng nghiêng đợi chờ, sỏi đá trông em từng giờ, nghe buồn nhịp chân bơ vơ.
Hi, everybody. Happy Monday. And I hope everyone is well. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 880th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Tuan Andrew Nguyen and Tao Leigh Goffe. We're thrilled to welcome poet Sarah Wang here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Tuan Andrew Nguyen is an artist whose work utilizes strategies of remembrance to highlight unofficial and suppressed histories, interweaving the factual and the speculative, and often employing mythologies of otherworldly realms. Nguyen's films rework dominant narratives into stories that propose creative forms of healing the intergenerational traumas of colonialism, war, and displacement. Through his interest in animism and material memory, the affective and historical charge embedded into objects, Nguyen's installations and sculptural practice coincide with and expand on the themes explored in his films. And our host today, Dr. Tao Leigh Goffe, is a London-born Black British award-winning writer, professor, and interdisciplinary sound artist who grew up between the UK and New York. She studied literature at Princeton University before pursuing a PhD at Yale, which led her to explore global Black and Asian intellectual histories, political and ecological life. Tao is writing a book called After Eden on how the climate crisis is a racial crisis. She lives and works in Manhattan, where she's an artist in residence at Columbia University and a member of New Inc. She's the executive director of the Afro-Asia Group, an organization that centers the intersections of African and Asian diasporas. And with that, I'll pass it over to Tao. Thank you so much, Tao.
Thank you, Chloe, for being our MC today. I'm just thrilled to see all of these different names on the screen. You know, we're here between time zones, which I think makes today even more exciting. So Radiant Remembrance is Tuan's first US solo show, and it just is an incredible honor to be able to think about sound and what he gives us in terms of different rituals. So yeah, today's conversation will be structured by my interests because I'm starting it off, but I really am excited that we can open it up to look globally. My research looks at Afro-Asian intimacies, as Chloe described, but I'm really just interested in different strategies for how we can grapple the different silences of the past and the kind of questions of the burden of these different histories, but also intergenerational healing as much as trauma. So I guess I'll just dive in with the first question. And I want to preface it by saying that for me today, this will be an exercise in restraint because there's so many questions I want to ask Tuan, but I'm going to focus it so that we can also just allow folks to, write their questions and submit them in the chat later. So I figured that I would begin with maybe giving people a sense of the exhibition that is on at the new museum right now. And for me, it felt like with the various different artists that are there, there's this kind of world building taking place. There are these different portals. But Tuan, within your show, I feel like there are many different portals that you give us. And I felt that in terms of the different films on display, there's a kind of punctuation, and we get that in the form of sculpture, but also in the form of still photography. So I thought maybe we could begin our conversation by talking about family photography as a portal. Yes, so this image really struck me because I felt like I knew these people. My family is from Jamaica, from China, from different parts of the world, but not from Senegal or Vietnam. And yet so many of these faces felt familiar to me. Yeah, why don't you tell us about your journey through family photography? And even you could begin with baby pictures of yourself. I think it would just be amazing to hear about the texture of these material objects and how your journey began in doing this incredible work.
Well, first of all, I just want to give a big thanks to the Brooklyn Rail, to Fong and for Chloe for having us today. And thank you, Tao, for making time and space and mental space for kind of being in this conversation. I'm very honored by it all. Yeah, the family photo, what an interesting place to begin. All right, so maybe I can start with my own kind of, I think this is the reason why I'm obsessed with family photography. When my family managed to get to Malaysia and situate ourselves in a refugee camp after a 10-day long boat trip in an escape from Vietnam, the only photo of me that survived the journey was a photo of me as a 6-month-old baby. And so the next photo of me that is taken, I think 2.5, almost 3 years old. So there's a gap in my own kind of history. And I think about how we put so much emphasis on the image, on the photo, as being a tool of memory. The association we have to this kind of object that remembers with us or for us is a very strong one, right? I think of ancestor worship, ancestor veneration. It's a kind of a tradition that runs throughout different cultures in the world. It's very strong in Vietnam. There is a history of photography here in Vietnam, particularly because the French were colonizing the country for 100 years. And in between that was the advent of photography. So some of the first images of people of the world, of indigenous people, for instance, were taken in Vietnam. So there's this really strange correlation for me, this fascinating correlation for me between the image on the altar, the image as taken and archived by the dominant narrative, and the family portrait, and how the family portrait kind of, in some ways, could be a very strong anti-archive, so to speak. We'll get into that more, but I think for me, that's where my kind of interest is. And I think of the photo as you kind of mentioned, Tao, as an object. It is an object. Very different in the way it kind of exists now with, the frequency and the number of photos that one person takes on their smartphones. Back then, the photo as an object was a significant thing. And I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely say that I share that interest. I've been able to luckily travel across the world and find long lost relatives. And I've been surprised to find in Hong Kong, of all places, that there was a mantelpiece where long lost cousins actually had photographs of my family members that I knew. So it's like photo becomes this kind of portal of translation. And I just really felt that powerfully in terms of the ancestor veneration and the kind of focusing on this object, as well as the incense. And yeah, just the ritual of the bowing and kind of just being open. So I would love to touch on Because No One Living Will Listen. And maybe you could explain it for folks who haven't had the chance yet to see the new museum show. But I would love to, Chloe, if we could see the image of the gateway. I just found it so incredible that we get this kind of sci-fi actual sense of a portal. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, Tuan, and just what it meant for you to have that last scene kind of situated with this ancestral practice with the incense, and what the portal might mean to you as a kind of gateway regarding citizenship.
Yeah, so Because No One Living Will Listen is a short, I think it's a 10-minute, 2-channel video installation that revolves around a woman that I met. Her name is Go Swang in Vietnamese, but her Moroccan name is Habiba Ben Isa. She's the daughter of a Moroccan soldier who fought for the French army during the First Indochina War, which is the war in which Vietnam starts uprising against its colonizer, actually, basically. During the war, a few hundred North African soldiers defected the French army to join forces with the Vietnamese. And, sorry, I'm trying to wrap my head around all the facts. It's a little bit late here. I'm usually not up at this hour. Ho Chi Minh set aside a piece of land called the Nông Trường Việt Phi, which is the Viet African farmstead, in which these soldiers who defected the French army could live, could raise a family, could kind of, partake in different agricultural kind of ways of making an income. And it ran from, I think, my dates could be off a few years, but 1954 all the way to 1972. So these North African soldiers, which consisted of Moroccan soldiers, Algerian soldiers, Tunisian soldiers, were all living there with their Vietnamese wives and Vietnamese children. They were then repatriated in 1972 during the Second Indochina War, which is the American War, is what it's called in Vietnam. And Habiba, the main character in this film, her father dies when she's only 2 years old. So her family never got to repatriate, or never got to leave Vietnam to return to Morocco or to go to Morocco. And she has a very kind of difficult life in Vietnam because of this. And in our conversations, she had always wanted to have a conversation with her dad. So I suggested, what about writing a letter? so she writes a letter to her father, and there's this other phenomenon, this other moment in this history where these Moroccan soldiers who defected from the French army decides to build a gate. They call the Moroccan Gate, and supposedly it's supposed to be a sign of solidarity between the Moroccan soldiers and Vietnam. This was built somewhere between, again, my dates could be a little bit off. I don't have my notes in front of me. I'm totally unprepared for this conversation, but it's built between 1954 and 1962. And so in the film, the kind of speculative moment that we kind of decided on together is that she doesn't know how to send this to her father. So the gate actually becomes a portal for her in which the letter kind of gets to the other side, so to speak. Sorry, that was very long-winded. But yeah, so it revolves around two things. The Moroccan Gate, which is this kind of object built by these Moroccan soldiers, and this woman who writes a letter trying to communicate to one of the soldiers that defected.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that helps to contextualize all of the different worlds, solidarities, coalitions, and also temporalities that you're just so powerfully engaging with. And I don't know, it's just been incredible getting to like sit with the work, because at the museum and in these contexts, you kind of, it's crowded. You get to see one scene in particular, perhaps, but it just has been a kind of moment for me in sitting with your work to be able to feel like I'm having these questions answered that I didn't even know I needed answering. So it's just been a really, incredible weekend just preparing for this. So I just wanted to say that, because I trace these kinds of itineraries of the Black Pacific in Dutch Empire and British Empire. And of course, there's these parallel histories in the former French Empire. And yeah, I look forward to the kind of work that can be done to bring all of these different African and Asian diasporas together. So I guess that brings me to the next question that I have, and it's related to the character of Habiba, but maybe we'll have her kind of pass the baton to another character who by trade collects rubbish or refuse or trash. I mean, I'm curious about the translation in Vietnamese or in French and how that is described. But there's a kind of materiality of the scrapyard and also of unexploded bombs, of ordnance, of metal that becomes reused. And I found that really fascinating if we think about the work that Habiba does to collect and recycle to earn a living. But then also in terms of your other protagonist, she also is missing her father. There's this kind of absence. So yeah, I guess I would love to now just kind of shift to thinking about silence and maybe this question of absence. So a long time ago, I was kind of thinking about the sort of frustration that we might have with silence and what we do when we confront this work. Because, you know, these family photographs, they don't speak necessarily. So I phrased it this way, and I said, in the diaspora, there is always a silence between the generations. And sometimes it is so loud that it keeps secrets from the future. So I guess that's just an invitation to meditate on silence and how heavy silence can be. I think this is a theme throughout your work and especially in your film work. But yeah, there's a heaviness, and the line, the bomb is heavy, also sat with me in terms of like what it is that we are asked to carry, but also what is not said. So that's all just to say, I would love to hear what you're thinking about silence and absence.
Yeah, no, that was so beautiful. That little piece of writing that you shared, Tao. I I think, I'm just kind of thinking about it now. I think I try to fill, like literally I fill the silences in the way that I sound design. I try to fill it up. Um, and it's an act that might seem impossible, actually. I think about the silences between the main character of The Unburied Sounds and her mother. So just to back up a little bit, the main character is actually based on a person. The location is a real location. We borrowed this scrapyard in Guangxi from this person who who the main character is based on. She didn't want to play herself, but we borrowed her name and her house and everything about her. And we kind of, added a little bit to the story. So The Unburied Sounds of a Troubled Horizon is actually a collection of multiple stories that was shared with me during my couple of years of research in that area. And it's kind of weaved together to form this story, this film. There are some people that actually play themselves. There are people in which characters are based on. The locations are as real as possible. The protagonist in the film, and her mother have a very strained relationship. And I think even though they speak, there's a lot of silences that are that exist between the words in which they share with each other. Her mother in the film suffers from a kind of PTSD, a kind of trauma that she has problems confronting. And it's up to with the protagonist to kind of figure out a way to kind of, in those silences, to help her mother, and in so doing helps herself. Sorry, I'm going to be rambling a lot tonight, so please just jump in and tell me to, or like.
No, I mean, I feel like as far as the sound design, the sound is very full. And yeah, maybe we can just jump into talking more specifically about the texture of the sound, because it's interesting you describe the relationship as awkward between the mother and daughter, because I just felt like it was very familiar and I completely understood it. But maybe that's just part of diasporic being. And yeah, the gaps I feel are filled with different types of sound. And maybe we could even get into explaining, for those who are here who haven't experienced it, like the different categories of sound, because I really felt the texture of the ambient sound and those decisions that you and your team are making, but also of the chants, so the kind of sacred sound, and the folk songs. You had me thinking about, I guess, my film studies days of like metadiegetic sound and the kind of storytelling that you have sound doing in these different layered ways. So I just feel that the score really speaks volumes, but it's also just, I don't know, just the texture of heightening the senses and the sound of like hearing something next door. So it sounds like it's at a distance. And just for me, as someone who DJs, I often think about like the low pass filter and just different sound effects that you can use to make people feel a kind of proximity. So yeah, If we can look at slide 10, maybe you could talk about not only designing sound for the actual film, but also what it meant to design sound with this unexploded bomb and just the weight of what that meant.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which we kind of understand with our bodies. And I'm hoping that there's an overlap between that kind of understanding, that very visceral, like physical, kind of embodied kind of journeying through an experience, and the kind of more cerebral kind of approach to understanding narrative that happens inside the space. And what's even more interesting is that some of the objects are actually in the space, and they can be activated theoretically in the space. So it adds another kind of layer of sound that could happen beyond, I mean, what would that be called? Beyond diegetic sound. Like it's a real kind of real vibrations from real metal penetrating your body, you know, in that space, in the same space as you're kind of experiencing the narrative, which I think could be quite interesting for people who who are sensitive to that, right? This particular object.
Yeah, I think so, and I think you can tune into it. Sorry, go ahead.
No. You're right. You can tune into it and you can feel it in a different way. You know, it's like, you know, sound coming from speakers, even though we try to kind of work it so it's at the right frequency, and we're recording like these bells that we're making, and we're, you know, using it to design the soundtrack and the ambient sound. And sometimes it's just very subtle and it's there, and you feel it, but you don't know it's there. And then the actual vibrations caused by the metal that's in the space, that has a presence, that is more kind of felt in your body, has it then the different effects. This particular object here is called unexploded resonance. It's a M117 is what it's called. It was dropped from a B-52. There's a lot of carpet bombing campaigns throughout this region in Vietnam. And we actually had tried to ship this over to the US twice and failed twice. And luckily we were able to get it out this time around. So I was super happy to see it in the new museum. And there's an irony there, just in the fact, in it being there in the US, right? To send a bomb back to where it came from is something of a story in itself. But this bomb references a story told by a monk in the film. And that story is actually based on a real story of a real monk who used to run a temple, not in Quang Tri, but in Quang Ngai, which is a little bit further away. But for those who haven't seen the film, there was a small temple that happened to sit in line of this carpet bombing campaign by these B-52s in 1963. And the first bomb that dropped in the vicinity dropped about 50 meters away. So that's about 50 yards away from the front of the temple. And it exploded, and it just took out the front wall of the temple. There were about 20, 30 people inside the temple or something like that. And the second bomb dropped right next to the temple, and it didn't explode. So technically it's an unexploded ordnance. And the statistic is that 1 in 3 bombs didn't explode. I don't know if that's a malfunction issue or if it was a kind of an intentional design thing. But this bomb that dropped right next to the temple did not explode. So the head monk of the temple diffused it himself, and then he hung it up in front of the temple. And people asked him why he would do such a thing, and he said that it was to remind people that if a bomb can have this much compassion, then we should too. In a nutshell, I'm paraphrasing now. But he saw the compassion in a bomb that didn't explode. So it's a very kind of animistic way of thinking. So we couldn't get that particular bomb, but we made one, and we actually tuned this one to a frequency that scientists are kind of doing a lot of research on. It's this 432 hertz frequency that supposedly has this really great potential to heal not only PTSD, like, you know, psychological trauma, but they're doing research on using it to kind of cure all sorts of ailments for people.
Yeah, that's fascinating because there's so much that I was feeling throughout your different works about the sacred and the profane, sacred sound, but also what more unholy thing than war. And yeah, the role of the monks felt really significant. And it made me think about, I guess, in terms of my own background, reggae music and how it is quite ceremonial. And yeah, there's a kind of resonance, there's a kind of grounding, as it's called in Jamaica, of, I think, finding that frequency. And it is by chants, drum circles, and being open to this like visceral experience where the body can become like an antenna, like even in the dance hall, right? It's like you said, it's just so visceral to feel the sound waves through like the cavity of your chest, of your body. And I really got that sense from the monks in the film, in how they understood sound as energy, as these wavelengths. I guess I would love to carry that thread to, again, ritual, religion, and music. So if we could play a clip from, I think it's Becoming, in Senegal, where we have this person who's singing. I felt like this would be nice for the audience. We're kind of at the midpoint to get a sense of your earlier work. But, you know, as much as in terms of all the cosmologies, obviously there's Catholicism, there's Tibetan Buddhism in the room. There's also Islam, if we're thinking about Senegal. And I just felt like the repetition, the trance-like nature of sound, the devotional, was so powerful for me in listening to this many times today, and especially with headphones. So I was very grateful in, you know, preparing for this to be able to have the videos themselves, because it's just a world of difference hearing at the museum than hearing it like with DJ headphones or on a sound system. So maybe we could listen for a bit, and you could tell us about yeah, ritual and sound, or how it was that this came to be kind of a score for that earlier work.
So xoolee li nga dund ci lu wees nga yaakaar ni rëccu dana wees ba lu xew dal di doon lu yees nga dal di am xol bu fees gis nañ ku ñàkk yaay ñàkk baay ñàkk maam teg si ñàkk waay ci seeni dund doo ko gis ci ñoom ndax ñoo ngi bég di sant te fas jom jàmbu yi sant la yàllay dollil Jambuy tuub la yàllay jéggal jambuy muñ la yàllay jox ndam jambuy ami teggin la yàllay jox barke.
Wow, it's just so powerful.
No,
Right?
wow, for
Yeah,
sure. Every time I hear Narani sing, I'm just like,
it's
oh my
overwhelming.
God. Yeah. Yeah. No, I just saw Narani a few months ago, and he did this performance with me in Barcelona.
Wow. It's
So
just it's like exalting to this other plane, what he's tuning into.
yeah, totally. So Narani is a religious singer. When he's in Europe now. When he was in Senegal, he would, sing at a mosque very frequently. And he wrote this piece for the song. I mean, he wrote this song for this film. His grandmother is Vietnamese. And I met him through working with the Senegalese Vietnamese community in Dakar. And we were kind of doing this unofficial casting. And Narani shows up, and we're reading scenes, and then I asked Narani, like, what is it that you want to do? How do you want to, participate in this film? And he's like, I'd like to write a song and I'd like to sing it. And I was like, okay, let's do that. Not knowing his background and not knowing that he had the voice that he had. And he just kind of blew me away. He just blew me away. There's another kind of musical moment in the film where General Jean Gomis is singing the South Vietnamese national anthem. And General Jean Gomis is, he speaks perfect Vietnamese. He was born in Vietnam, left when he was 14, and joined the French army. Yeah, very, very interesting character. But he has memorized the South Vietnamese national anthem, and he really wanted to sing that song. So these two kind of moments in that particular film, for me, I mean, there's a way that national anthems are designed to kind of, tug at your heartstrings and make you feel, like you want to defend your country, right? They're designed in that way. And then Narani's song just kind of untangles that for me. It operates on a different kind of frequency, so to speak. Yeah, I don't know. And I just like how those two generations and how those two kind of musical spectrums kind of operate together in this film.
Yeah, there's such a like anti-colonial call and response of these echoes, and to me it's across space and time. So I'm just honored to be able to sit with the films and to have the screener copies to watch it again and again, because I think your work requires that. And I'm going to try and go to the new museum before it closes many times, because it's a lot. It's heavy to sit with these histories, what people have put here, even, these family photographs on the screen. I do family photograph workshops, and I just try to preface it with, there's a lot we're bringing into the room, even in unexpected ways. People may think they've reconciled that relationship, but it's emotional work that could require maybe many hours to decompress from.
You're right though, Tao. Like it
Right.
From the viewer, it requires some commitment in terms of time, and to kind of be open emotionally to these stories, right? And Yeah, and it's a challenging exhibition. I completely understand. But I hope people do kind of can walk into the space and just let it sit or sit with the work a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's like you have to prepare yourself to surrender, which I guess brings me back to Islam and thinking about what I've learned of as tajweed, or like this repetition of the Quran or of learning. And I just think across so many traditions, there is this repetition that becomes part of something transcendent. So I just wanted to say that I really, really felt that.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, chanting is
and
very much about repetition. Sorry to cut you off, but
yeah,
you know, chanting is very much a part of that kind of repetition and kind of like when you were talking about reggae music, you know, like you give yourself up to the world, essentially.
yeah,
Like when your molecules are vibrating at that particular frequency with everybody else in the same room, you're kind of giving you're dissolving. You're giving yourself up to that, whatever that is, and whatever you believe in, that's what you're kind of giving yourself up to.
totally. And maybe that for some would be salvation or nirvana or a goal. And it's interesting that one of your main characters says, so could I be reincarnated as a sound? Like, could I come back? And
Yeah,
like, we are energy. So it was just an interesting philosophical question and moment in the film.
yeah, totally.
I'll be thinking about that for a while. Yeah, so I guess I would love to also talk about nationalism, anthems, as you brought up. I've been writing a piece for a while now on sound studies and the anti-colonial, which I would love to share with you because it just felt so on point with your whole body of work and these kind of anti-colonial antiphonies or call-in responses. And it led me to thinking about Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth, which has seen a renaissance in terms of people citing it, especially since 2020, people waking up to the fact that this incredible work on decolonization has been written so long ago. And I was thinking about the fact that The Wretched of the Earth is a line from the Internationale. So yeah, this image, Chloe knows exactly what I wanted to look at here. The listing of these different nationalities or parts of French Empire, in quotes, Senegal, Guinea, Somali, Tunis, Annam, Sudan. Yeah, just amazing to have a portrait like this because it really conjures for me the fact that Fanon in Martinique would be drawn to that line of this Marxist anthem, but he would draw on the wretched of the earth, right? And those who would be slaves. So I would love to just hear your thoughts on, what it means to have an image like this and why you felt you needed to connect it in terms of the quote unquote darker nations, as Vijay Prashad calls it, or like these formerly colonized places of the world, and how it is that they're able to, be in proximity to each other, but even more so, be in a proximity that also leaves room for defecting together or finding ways to conspire or collude. I just found this image so incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by this image because what it allowed me to do was imagine all these different kind of relationships, these solidarities in the time of war amongst colonized soldiers of the colonial army. I mean, the other part of the image that kind of just blows my mind is how cool these men look, right? It looks like a like a
Stylish.
GQ like spread, right? Like they
Yeah.
look cool, calm, and collected. This was an image that I had found, I think, online or on Instagram like years ago, but it was super small and it had hashtag World War One Africa. And it took me years to find the source of this image. And I found it in the German archives.
Hmm.
And what it is an image taken during World War One. The caption on the image, and there's not very many captions on this image, right? I wish I had known, I wanted to like know the names of these men or what year they were born or what village they're from, but there's, you know, this is the problem with the archive, with the dominant archive. There's no, the captions are not there. They don't care about that information. We know that these are prisoners of war from these particular countries, right? And they're all, so all these men were probably tirailleurs, French colonial soldiers, caught in a POW camp in Germany. And this was 1917, 1918 or something like that. And yeah, the lack of information is what kind of struck me. Yeah,
It just
what else?
makes so much
Yeah.
sense that France would use them, use colonial management to fight against one another, but that so many of them chose to be disloyal to that mandate, right?
Well, the thing that we don't know, or at least I didn't know, was that during World War One and World War Two, like hundreds of thousands of colonial soldiers were shipped from the different colonies throughout, you know, the French Empire to Europe in defense of France,
Yeah.
risking their lives for France.
Mhm.
And then for me, the irony was that when, you know, the uprising started in Vietnam, you know, suddenly these colonial soldiers from, you know, West Africa, North Africa, Madagascar, even Martinique, were then shipped to Vietnam to squash that uprising.
Wow.
So the, you know, the violence runs deep. But for me, this photo was a moment where these men were together, and, you know, all sorts of kind of imaginations came out of my head to kind of, you know, to wanting to figure out if these men, what kind of personal kind of relationships did these men have? Did they speak French to each other? Did they speak to each other in a kind of creolized French? Did they shower together? Did they hold hands? I don't know. All those things like came to my mind. Like I wanted to imagine that just based on this one photo. So I don't know.
Yeah, I
So
mean, it's
very
like,
powerful.
were they lovers? What were the different
Yeah.
intimacies?
Yeah. What were the intimacies between these men?
Yeah, and I think it's just fascinating. Like Monique Chung, whose work I've written about, the Book of Salt, she really takes us in that kind of time traveling space to imagine these kinds of intimacies of the past by, you know, putting Ho Chi Minh in Paris in the same moment with Lamine Senghor, and giving us a way to think through how anti-colonial things have always been, in fact, and especially in that interwar period. So yeah, it's just exciting to me to see more of this in the French Empire, because I have more emphasis on the British and the Dutch.
Right.
And I guess it brings me to my final, I guess, set of questions before we open it up, which is about collaboration. So we can imagine these men here working together, perhaps. We can think about how loaded the term collaboration could be during any given war. But I guess just taking collaboration as a keyword, what does it mean to you in terms of, you know, the many different people that you have thanked for being part of your process, you know, the people you're interviewing? I guess I'm secretly wondering, because I also love to collaborate, but it's really, really hard. it can be heartbreaking, but I think it's necessary to a certain kind of artistic practice. We could even think about, I know that you used to be a breakdancer, or maybe you still are, but there's a certain kind of choreography of collaboration that I think one learns and like is always like within someone. I see DJing as very collaborative too, like who's gonna set up the decks, take it down, like who's all there. So yeah, I guess, can you tell us a bit about your process and what collaboration means to you?
Wow, that's a hard one. I don't think I'd have a practice if it wasn't for the idea of collaboration. So much of my work is about working with people. So for those who don't know, I also work as part of a collective called the Propeller Group. And the Propeller Group was very active for a long number of years. And it's only been within the last, I don't know, 5 years that I've really gotten a chance to focus on my own practice, which is an extension of the collaborative practice of the collective, but kind of takes a different approach, where I am very, very interested in working with communities that I feel very close to, and to make stories together. I think the process of making film is a very collaborative one, and it kind of opens it up to a collaborative process where you can incorporate and include a lot of different people. You know, like when I met Nareni, he, you know, wasn't really into acting, but he wanted to sing. Or, you know, some people wanted to write stories. Some people are poets. Some people like to do fashion, so they do, you know, costuming. And some people, the list goes on, and there's always a place for somebody in that process. But also, you know, when you're working with communities that have experienced a very specific kind of moment in history, like these Vietnamese women and children who migrated from Vietnam to West Africa, right? It's a very specific kind of moment in history, and those kind of moments in history are often not talked about by the dominant narrative. So I feel like it really takes a lot of people to be able to tell the story and to make it dimensional. So it's not from a singular point of view, but it's from many singular points of views. And that makes the story, that enriches the story in a way that that couldn't happen if it wasn't collaborative.
And I think that's such an ethical approach, if we can approach an ethics as a strategy. Like someone mentioned critical fabulation in the chat, and it's like, how do you not trespass, right? So they're referring to Saidiya Hartman's term about like reconstructing that past. And I would say it does feel like you are collaborating with the present, maybe the future, but definitely the past, and giving justice to all these perspectives by having the different channels and even perspectives. Yeah, that really came across for me. It's like collaborating across space and time.
Yeah, I think for me also, like that speculative space is very prominent in the Spectre of Ancestors Becoming, because all of the scenes are speculative scenes based on very personal traumas
And the letter writing, it just,
right. Yeah. But I think, you know, the speculative element of storytelling here is crucial, actually, because it, you know, we inherit trauma, intergenerational trauma. And it's so easy to be stuck and to be imprisoned by that trauma, for lack of a better word. And the only kind of space that I have been able to see as a means in which we can have some sort of agency in working through our trauma is that speculative space.
Yeah.
That space of imagination, that space of like dealing with ghosts, but not ghosts of the past, but ghosts of the future.
Yes, the future. And I think that gap is so important as a space of play. And I guess, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but we have to talk about Alexander Calder, and maybe let's discuss him as a collaborator. Because I can think about, so slides 17 and 18, just to give a sense to those who will or won't get to visit the new museum show. It's just great to see the scale there of the mobile. But I often talk about, you know, people want to bring ancestors into the room, but you have to be careful which ones you bring into the room. So this idea that the Vietnamese woman is wondering, is she possessed by Alexander Calder? He died in 1976. Is this a reincarnation that she is creating this art, you know, that's exactly in the language that he spoke in? Talk to us about your collaboration with Calder.
Sorry, I just spit all over my laptop. So her mother in this film thinks that she's demonic, thinks that she's possessed by an evil spirit because she's taken this material that has caused her family so much suffering, caused the people in this community, in this land, so much suffering, and she's obsessed with it, and she turns it into these kind of hanging objects. Mother doesn't know what modern kinetic sculpture is, so she thinks it's like evil, it's demonic, and why would you use this kind of material? So that, you know, with the protagonist in the film, she doesn't know any other way. So when her mother keeps calling her demonic, she's like, okay, I have to, maybe I am, maybe I'm possessed by an evil spirit. So she goes on this journey to kind of figure out what it is. And she just so happens to come across a magazine, and she sees this article, and she sees that some of the things that she's made out of bob material is almost in the exact form of someone who had, you know, lived before her and died 49 days before she was born. And he happens to be this artist named Alexander Calder. Everybody asked me why Calder. And I still haven't quite figured out a convincing answer yet. I was thinking about material reincarnation, right? Like I had made a previous 2-channel video, part of this kind of research, and spoken from the point of view of a UXO in Guangxi, and the bomb questions like, what am I going to be after they blow me up? What am I going to become? So it's been infused by this animistic kind of belief system. And I was thinking about reincarnation. I was thinking about material reincarnation, like making this material into something else, right? Something that can heal. But I wanted to kind of pair it or run it in parallel with a kind of more spiritual reincarnation. And I think I was scrolling through Instagram one day and I saw this calder and I was like, wow, that looks like the way that it was hung and how it was cascading. I had looked at some images before, maybe an hour before, looking at carpet bombings during the Vietnam. And I was like, wow, it struck me as something that looks like an abstract bombing. And then I did some research into Calder, and he happened to be very vocal about, in his anti-war stance during the Vietnam War. And so, the more I looked into Calder and the more I was looking at his mobiles and his work, the more it felt like Calder was trying to say something.
Wow. And he said it to you through Instagram. He found you.
Instagram and the main character.
And I guess it made me think about contemporary art, but also just scale and the kinds of artists that get the room to play, to experiment. And I guess to conclude, I would just, love to see more different dynamic environments for work like yours. Like imagine this at Storm King. Imagine the kind of, I don't know, space people are given to really like give that vision. So I just wanted to thank you for all of these offerings because it just feels like the sculpture is a shrine, but like you said, the kind of, if you allow it to be, the films themselves are performing a potential healing for anyone who's open to that experience and reckoning with ongoing colonialism and what is not resolved about the American war. So thank you, Tuan.
Thank you, Tao.
Wow. Tao and Tuan, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that incredibly generous and illuminating dialogue. We have a Q&A right now. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please feel free to post it in the chat and I will pass you the virtual mic. But I'm going to start us off with a question. Tuan, I wonder if you can speak a little bit about the title of the exhibition, Radiant Remembrance. I've been thinking about that a lot, just as you've been talking about radiance and its various meanings, how it sort of signals joy and light, but it also signals a kind of clarity, a kind of rootedness in the presence, especially remembrance, which both speaks to a past from a present. And I was thinking about that relative as well to this idea of ghosts of the future. And I wonder how you landed on Radiant Remembrance and how you think about that title relative to your work.
Yeah, our ghosts live in the future. There was a line in a film called The Island that I had shown at the Whitney Biennial in 2017, where the main character says that particular thing. He says, our ghosts live in the future. And I think it's a condition very much of people who have migrated. I was thinking particularly of refugees, particularly these refugees who had kind of ended up on this island called Pulau Bidong. But Radiant Remembrance was actually the title of a sculpture that I had made, a small sculpture that I had made years ago that kind of looked at an event in the southern part of Vietnam where a bridge had collapsed. And the event was kind of written about in the newspapers, and then suddenly it was gone, because it's a long story, but the rebar in the bridge that was supposed to be used was exchanged for bamboo, which the foreman probably pocketed a lot of money from in saving kind of costs, and the bridge collapsed. But it got erased. That story got erased very quickly in the media. And I made this object as kind of an offering, as a way to kind of remember that moment. And it was thinking about how I think about light a lot. I think about how memory kind of, for me, functions as these beams of light for some reason. And I thought when I was in conversation with Vivian Crockett to kind of figure out a kind of short and sweet, concise way of titling this exhibition of 3 works, one new one, that kind of word pairing came to mind. I liked it because of its alliteration, and I liked it because it dealt with memory, but it's like a memory that kind of travels into the future beyond oneself. Not a memory, but remembrance, which is very active, right? It's a very kind of active form of veneration. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the different kind of things that I was thinking about in regards to radiant remembrance.
Thank you so much for that. And Tao, I really liked the point you made as well about the radiance of the moon in the chat as well.
Yeah, because I just felt the title, this, if I had had more questions, it would have been exactly what you had said, Chloe. And it felt to me like there's obviously suffering there and trauma, but it just felt like you're giving us this affect of something that's bright and emanating. And then, yeah, the moon feels like it's important in the work too. So yeah, the title is just so poetic.
Thank you. You know, the moon is a here we don't celebrate the solar, we don't, work on the solar calendar, we work on the lunar calendar. The New Year's is also a lunar New Year's. There was I think it was an art form article written about Alexander Calder in 1972, where the title of the article was "The Sun Rises in Calder." And it's about how Calder was on a ship on his way to Paris and he sees the sunrise, and it kind of changes his way of looking at, I don't know, art making. And I think, that motif kind of, works its way into his formal practice. In the film, The Unburied Sounds, the main character, her name is Nguyet, which means moon. And she kind of flips that kind of around a little bit. Anyways, the moon plays a very, very important part in the practice.
Okay, because I knew I was feeling the moon and it's like feminine power as well. I have a lab or a collective and we like to write at midnight. So it's funny that this is late for you, but this is like very early for me. And I find there's a lot of creativity in the moonlight. So yeah.
For sure, yeah.
Love that. Well, we have one more question from Carolyn, and then we'll conclude today's event with a poetry reading.
Hi, thank you both so much for this conversation today. I mean, Tuan, well, you both spoke a bit about silence, and I've just been really stuck with that throughout the conversation, like how, and I would love to just hear you speak a bit more about really how one enacts silence, or I mean, presence is absence, but I really get the feeling of, I mean, listening, like while making a mark. And yeah, I guess I'm just curious to hear you speak a bit more about silence, if you could.
I think sometimes it's, my work is so much about penetrating the silence, right? The silence of the different erasures that have happened because of colonialism, the forced silences of colonialism, but the silences that come out of colonialism, right? The shame to speak, or the trauma that inhibits us from speaking. But then on the other hand, I think sometimes silence is quite a powerful act. Almost in the same way that I think storytelling is a very powerful act, and a powerful act of political resistance. Sometimes I think silence is also a very powerful act of political resistance. I remember I did a performance or a talk in college or right out of college, and I was supposed to talk about my work, and then I read this poem by Pablo Neruda called "Keeping Quiet." I think, you know, there's a history of intellectuals in China that just, you know, didn't want to partake in the political climate of the time, and they remained silent and, you know, went into the mountains. So for me, I think, you know, depending, it's a choreography that we do as people that have inherited these traumas. It's a dance, right? Sometimes we have to penetrate the silence and we have to be very loud, and then sometimes, you know, silence is the best option at times. So yeah, I don't know, I have very mixed feelings about, you know, silence, even though my work is very much about like breaking the silence. In my own kind of personal life, I'm very aware that silence sometimes could be more powerful and penetrating than, you know, keeping talking, which right now I should shut up and just be silent.
No, not at all. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I guess if I could chime in, I feel like I often think about it in terms of what's muted and mutilated when it comes to colonial histories, and in particular with family photography. So I just wanted to thank Tuan. It's just been great. Like, we've been sharing family photographs, and I shared one of a passport photo of my grandfather that has canceled across it. And I do think there is this kind of silence that we have to be okay with sitting with. And it kind of came up for me in terms of, you can be frustrated about what you weren't told and what people would not say, but it's also the question of what they could not say. So I feel like there is respecting that trauma and understanding. Maybe some people just really can't even articulate what has happened in terms of these colonial violences.
Yeah, I mean, you're so much more articulate than I am, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's what I was trying to say, that, you know, sometimes, you know, because Tao, you and I were talking about how the photograph is really very much about a presence, right? In Asian cultures, when you see a photograph on an altar, it's about a person who had lived. But that photograph actually signifies their absence, because when they're on the altar, that means they're gone. So this play between a person's presence and their absence, or the presence of a story or the absence of a story, is it saturates the lives of people who have gone through these, you know, colonial moments. And I think that's fascinating.
Thank you so much for that question, Carolyn, and for those incredible answers, Tao and Tuan. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Sarah Wang, to the virtual stage. Sarah Wang has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The London Review of Books, The Nation, and N+1. She has received fellowships from MacDowell, PEN America Writing for Justice, Center for Fiction, NIFA, and is a Tin House Scholar. She teaches creative writing at Barnard College and is finishing a novel about plastic surgery, hair transplants, and reality television. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much. That talk was amazing. I just want to say that I've actually been to the New Museum twice to see your show, Tuan, and Osario's show. And I really am into this idea of the speculative and fiction as a way to deal with colonialism and historical violence, which also has a link to my reading today, which I'm going to read a few poems. They're blackout poems, and the source text is an incel mass shooter, half Chinese, half white mass shooter. His name is Elliot Rodger. But these poems are in no way about him. They're about my own process of trying to contend with a culture that breeds violence against women and people. So I feel like that's a cool link between the talk and my reading. Okay. This first poem is called All the Females. All suffering women realize how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. Life amongst humanity, cast out and rejected, forced to endure an existence of insignificance. All the females see the value in the story of how. This is the story of life, dark sadness, anger, and hatred, a story of war against cruel injustice. In this story, every single detail, every single experience, memory shaped the tragedy. Did things turn? Explain why. Blissful child, a world I thought was good and pure. That baby jazz. Independence began. I had no desire. I was afraid of trying. Adults are like a child. I continued, morning playing with the rest of time. I gave my all. I lived in the zone. My urge to elaborate fantasies in my mind, almost like fact. I didn't talk. I lied. I had pictures, and I had those pictures by accident. My voice was over. 3 came out. My mother, father, me. My child support payments enabled a we. Hadn't the trick missed? The new place was that bad part, this lower area. I hated that me, but alas, my life was no one I barely cared about. I was my own father. Stay with me. After dinner, let me always have that baby jazz, the man to see. The house despised having to be seen. Used to go up quite often. He, me, that kind of brutal witness culture. The wild boys all look for vicious animals. Evil exists by moving. Thrive there, destroy the place, retribution, to stay, to lose. I had enough there already. That searing was nothing that burned my heart. During that bed blood, the pain was a vegetable. After that, I subsided with greater ease. Time passed. I spent a lot of life. The house despised having to be seen. I, for a lonely virgin, being seen too much, visit this time, to have yet another life. And I was going again, but I refused to hear it. I moved with the goal of losing my desire. If I destroy it, I will run, confer with my psychiatrist, with my mother, outside in Beverly Hills. And when we were surprised that the conference too presented a conflict, an argument let me stay. During my trip, the doctor spent petty troubles. I was psychiatrist, psychologist, and counselor. Me in the past. I know wasted struggle. Such a world ended by prescribing a controversial medication. This absolute wrong, I refused. I never saw again after that. Towards the end, look down, my enemies represent. The man can. In such a world, the man can develop to greater heights than ever before. Future generations will live free of barbarity. Women will enable them to expand their intelligence and advance the human race. Perfect, shameful pity. The thing will never become a reality. To fantasize hatred towards all women, this whole ideology, destroy it. The day of power, all girls will live. They will all. That is the question, indeed. Why, men, why do things have to be this way? I ask all of you, turn towards this war, finish it, show the world true worth. That's it, and thanks so much for having me, everyone. Thanks for sharing this space.
Wow, thank you so much, Sarah, for reading today. That was brilliant and so powerful. Thank you so much. And thank you again, of course, to Tao and to Tuan across 2 time zones. Today, this conversation was absolutely brilliant and enlightening. And thank you so much to Sarah Morris at the New Museum, who helped a lot in preparation for this, as well as Sarah Stengel and the team at James Cohan for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also, of course, like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive. You can view this conversation and others on our YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Antonio Sergio Bessa, Alan Frame, Leslie Cozy, and Ksenia M. Soboliva on the occasion of Daryl Ellis Regeneration at the Bronx Museum. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Tommy Blount. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you, Brooklyn Rail. Thank you, Tao. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Sarah.
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 Bye, everyone. Have an inspiring rest of your day and go see the show at the New Museum if you can.
4
Bye,
weeks left.
everybody.
You.
Yes, 4 weeks left. Bye, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day or evening.